All right, so after fixing the blemishes and the skin tone, you can see I kind of finished up this other eyebrow, so it's relatively close to this other one. I could do a little more work, but for the sake of this project, that's okay. The next step is to smooth the overall skin tone. Now the trick here is that we don't want to do too much so that the subject looks like a mannequin or something, but we want to just kind of this is especially important if you're working with an older subject that has a lot of, crow's feet or wrinkles under the eyes, that kind of stuff. We don't have to do too much here, but we'll do what we can to smooth it out. Now this technique involves creating another duplicate layer. So I'm going to take this blemishes layer and I'm going to duplicate it, my layer, duplicate layer, and we're going to name this one skin tone. Click OK. All right, now what I'm going to do is blur the entire layer. So I'm going to go to the filter menu and down to blur. And there are several different ways, and I've used different types of blur for different projects. Sometimes I use surface blur, smart blur. The one that I've used for the longest, is the one that's been around the longest, is the Gaussian blur. So I'm going to show you that method. So I'm going to click on Gaussian blur. And you're going to see the preview here. Right now, by default, mine was on 4.9 for some reason. If you take it all the way up, you're going to lose all the detail. All the way down, you're not going to get any. So what I'm aiming for is I'm just looking at the skin and seeing at what point do those blemishes kind of start to disappear. And you want it a little bit more than the starting point. So right here around 5 pixels looks to be a pretty good setting. You can even take it up a little bit more. And this is kind of a trial and error thing. If you do too much, you can always do it again or take the opacity down. So we'll start here and see how that goes. So I'm going to click OK. Now, obviously, this is not how we want it to look. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mask this entire layer. And this is a pretty common technique in retouching, is to do whatever edit you want to do to the entire thing, then mask that layer, and then paint back in the areas that you want. So this entire skin tone layer, I'm going to add a blank mask, and then I'm going to invert that mask. Now to invert it, there's a way to do it up here. I can't remember where it is. I always use the keyboard shortcut, which is Command-I on a Mac or Control-I on a PC. And make sure you have the mask selected, so you have these little corner pieces around the mask and not the layer. So the mask selected, Command-I or Control-I, and the mask will turn from white to black. So now everything on this layer is hidden. All right, and you'll see that we see our image again that's non-blurred. So now what I'm going to do, because we're dealing with the mask, you'll notice that your foreground and background colors turn to black and white. And we're going to be painting, we're going to be revealing some areas, so we want white to be our foreground color. All right, so I'm going to zoom in pretty close on the skin again. And hold down spacebar to get the move tool so I can see what I want. Maybe that's a little too close. Then I'm going to get my brush. All right, I'm going to start with the big areas, relatively large brush. I got about 50 pixels here, and then I can lower it down if I need to get the smaller areas. And what I'm going to do is just paint over the skin areas that I would like to smooth out. All right, you want to leave as much fidelity in the edges as possible. For example, the edges of the eyebrow and the hair, you don't want to paint over those too much or they're going to get too blurry. So you want to leave as much fidelity in those edges as possible and just paint over the big areas of skin here. All right, and you'll see that this is really too much of an effect, but I'll show you how we're going to fix that here in just a minute. So I'll come down here and paint around the eye a little bit in the cheek. And the goal is just to kind of get rid of all of those, I don't know if you want to call them imperfections, but all the sort of texture in the skin. All right, the idea is to reduce this texture a little bit. I'll come right here, paint on the nose a little bit. But again, I'm leaving these shadows alone. All right, just kind of paint along the edges here. And you can look at your mask as you go to kind of see, you should start to see like a mask figure, like a Phantom of the Opera style. So I'm going to paint over the big areas, and we'll come down here and paint on her neck as well. And you can paint over the hair too. You're going to see that it kind of gets rid of some of those hairs, those stray hairs, which is good because it saves a little work down the line. Okay, so that looks pretty good for the neck. Got most of that covered. Now I'm going to get a slightly smaller brush to get in and get a little more detail. Take it down to about, maybe not that much, maybe about 20 pixels. And so now I can get this upper lip area, still leaving those sharp details alone. Just trying to get the big areas of skin. I'm going to leave the lips alone too, because we want that kind of shine on the lips. You know, beauty is it's in the eye of the beholder, as they say. It's all about perception. But there are some things that people just tend to see as more attractive. For example, symmetry. You know, fewer imperfections, that kind of stuff, whatever that means. So I'm not saying it's the only way to do it. This is the way that I do it. So all right, nostrils will get around the eyes a little bit, and that should be good. I'm going to leave the detail around the eyebrows and around the eyes especially, because the eyes are actually the first place that a person looks generally when they are looking at somebody. Well, hopefully it's the first place they look. But anyway, let's see, that looks pretty good. All right, so I'm pretty happy with that. Now I'm going to zoom out a little bit so you can see, and you can tweak this as you see fit, but just try and keep the edge fidelity as much as you can around these areas like the nose and the eyes and the mouth and the chin and all that. Oh, I got this little shoulder area I forgot about. You can paint that if you want to. All right, so now this is a little too much, like I said. And now if you want to see what it looks like without it, just hide it, and you'll see the skin tone that we started with and what we end up with. What I want is somewhere kind of in between. The reason I do a little too much is because I can always take it down a little bit, but sometimes it's harder to add more. So I did a little too much, and then what I'm going to do is actually take the opacity of this entire layer down. So I'm going to take the opacity down just a touch and kind of find that balance in between. I think right around 50% is what I want. Between 50 and 60% looks pretty good. Because when I zoom in, you still see some of that texture, but then you don't see all of it. All right? It just takes everything down just a touch. So I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm going to go ahead and save my file, Command S or File Save. And the next thing we're going to do is address the eyes and the teeth. All right.